Sex and the Middle Ages imagine a world where sex is both a sin and a source of joy, where it can be a path to damnation or a playful adventure. Medieval Europe, spanning roughly 500 to 1500 CE, was a place of stark contradictions when it came to sexuality. One moment, it seems like a society crushed under the weight of religious repression, and the next, it feels like a land where lust and desire ran wild. This duality is both shocking and fascinating, and it sets the stage for our exploration of medieval attitudes toward sex. In the deserts of late antique Egypt, the 4th and 5th centuries, a group of holy men known as the Desert Fathers lived in isolation, seeking to purify their souls through extreme asceticism. One of the most striking stories from this tradition involves a monk who is tempted by a woman sent by the devil. The woman, claiming to be lost and afraid of wild beasts, asks to stay in his cell. The monk, despite his best efforts, finds himself overwhelmed by desire. In a desperate act of self-punishment, he burns his fingers in a flame one by one, to prove his commitment to resisting temptation. This story, which remained popular for 1,000 years, paints a vivid picture of the medieval church's deep-seated fear and revulsion toward sexual desire. According to this view, sex was not just a sin, but a powerful force that could lead the soul to damnation. Yet this strict and sin-racked image of medieval sexuality is only one side of the coin. On the other side, we find a world where lust and pleasure were openly celebrated. The stories of Geoffrey Chaucer, Giovanni Boccaccio, and the French fabliaux offer a different perspective. In one fabliau, a wife cleverly deceives her husband to spend a passionate night with her young lover. The story is filled with humor and a carefree attitude toward sex, where the joy of the act is the main focus, and sin is not even a consideration. These tales were not hidden or secretive. They were openly enjoyed by both men and women, including members of the church hierarchy. This earthy and playful view of medieval sexuality suggests that, despite the church's teachings, many people found ways to enjoy life and indulge in their desires. The third image of medieval sexuality is much darker, reflecting a modern awareness of sexual violence. In the hit television series Game of Thrones, sexual assault and sadism are presented as endemic to the medieval world. While this portrayal is exaggerated for dramatic effect, it is not entirely without historical basis. Women traveling alone, like the visionary Marjorie Kemp, faced the real threat of sexual violence. Christian texts often depicted the torture of female martyrs by pagans, who would cut off their breasts to force them to renounce their faith. Young girls were sometimes married as soon as they reached puberty, and cases of clerical abuse of boys were not unheard of. However, it is important to note that the violence in medieval texts was often portrayed differently from modern depictions. For example, in the Divine Comedy, Dante observes sinners being tormented by demons, but this is a punishment for their sins, not a source of pleasure for the tormentors. Despite these grim realities, the medieval world was not a monolithic culture. Latin Christendom, with its regional variations, coexisted with Muslim polities in Iberia and Sicily, and Jewish communities under both Christian and Muslim rule. The Islamic world, like the Christian, also had its share of contradictions. The 1001 Nights begins with a tale of a king who, after discovering his wife's infidelity, embarks on a brutal regime of sleeping with and then executing a new woman each night. This story, set in a distant past and place, reflects a cultural concern for female chastity and male privilege. Yet, within the same collection, there are stories of romantic love and sexual freedom, showing that the discourse on sexuality was far from uniform. These conflicting images of medieval sexuality are not just a product of modern interpretations. They reflect the complex and multifaceted nature of the medieval world itself. Attitudes toward sex varied widely, even within the same culture. The Church's repressive teachings often carried over into secular society, particularly regarding women's sexuality, which was seen as both active and sinful. In contrast, men's sexuality was often celebrated, seen as a natural and even heroic expression of masculinity. The double standard is a familiar concept, and it is evident in many medieval texts and practices. Medieval people understood sex in a way that is quite different from modern views. For them, sex was an act where one person did something to another, particularly the act of penetration. This is reflected in the language they used. In French, the verb fouter meant to penetrate, and the subject was always a man. In English, swiven similarly meant to have sexual intercourse with a woman, with the man as the active subject and the woman as the passive object. Even in Latin, the verb concuber, to lie with, was most often used with a masculine subject. This way of thinking about sex was deeply ingrained in medieval culture, and it influenced how people viewed the roles of men and women in sexual relationships. Despite the Church's insistence on the sinfulness of sex, medieval society was far from uniform in its attitudes. Women were not always passive victims. They could be active and in control, particularly in matters of reproduction. The badges worn by people in the later Middle Ages, often depicting disembodied genitalia, sometimes showed women handling and even roasting penises, suggesting a more complex and nuanced view of sexual power dynamics. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval sexuality, we will explore these contradictions and the many different views that shaped the medieval experience. This journey will reveal a rich and complex landscape, where the boundaries between sin and pleasure, repression and freedom were often blurred. In the medieval world, the way people understood sex was quite different from today. For them, sexual acts were not seen as mutual experiences that both partners shared equally. Instead, they viewed sex as something one person did to another. This meant that men and women were thought to have very different experiences during sexual encounters. If the partners were of the same sex, medieval people often struggled to understand these relationships, especially between women, who were not always considered to be engaging in real sex unless one used a dildo. This perception that men and women experienced sex differently shaped how scholars today study medieval sexuality. Instead of grouping all sexual acts together, this book looks at them separately based on the gender and marital status of the people involved. This approach helps highlight the unique experiences and social roles of men and women in medieval times. Medieval society strongly believed in a binary view of gender, with men and women seen as fundamentally different. Although some medieval thinkers, following Aristotle, believed that women were essentially imperfect men, this did not mean they were treated the same. Women were clearly seen as a separate and lower category in the social hierarchy. Even those who chose a life of celibacy, like monks and nuns, were still recognized as men and women, even if they were sometimes seen as less real in their gender roles. Gender non-conformity did exist, but it was not widely accepted. People who did not fit neatly into male or female roles were often seen as deviant. Sometimes, these individuals were considered to be hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine, taking the traits of their gender to an extreme. Despite this, the basic binary between men and women remained strong. When we talk about sexuality in the medieval context, it's important to understand that this term, as we use it today, didn't exist back then. Medieval people didn't have a word that exactly matches our concept of sexuality, which encompasses desires, relationships, acts, and identities. For them, sexuality was more about the meanings they placed on specific sexual acts, rather than a broad personal identity. Today, we often distinguish between sex, gender, and sexuality. Sex refers to the physical characteristics of the body, like genes and genitals. Gender is about social roles and identities, such as being masculine or feminine. Sexuality is about desires and orientation. In medieval times, these concepts were more intertwined. If someone deviated from expected sexual behavior, it was seen as a reflection of their physical body and their gender. The modern debate about whether sexualities are inborn or a matter of choice is different from the academic discussion about whether sexualities are essential, existing independently across cultures, or socially constructed, shaped by the culture in which they exist. Most scholars today believe that sexuality is socially constructed, meaning it is created by the society in which people live. For example, having sex with someone under the age of 18 is considered sexual abuse in modern Western society, but in medieval times it was seen differently. Medieval people had a concept of an age of consent for marriage, but it didn't apply to sexual acts in the same way. The idea that sexuality is culturally created is crucial when studying medieval people. Modern terms like homosexual or heterosexual don't always apply. In ancient Greek and Roman cultures, Sexual identity was based more on the roles people played, active or passive, rather than the gender of their partners. Similarly, in medieval Europe, the distinction between homosexuality and heterosexuality was not as clear as it is today. The focus was more on whether the sex was reproductive or not, rather than the gender of the partners. Marriage was the expected norm for most medieval people, but it was not always seen as a positive thing. Many religious writers saw marital sex as a necessary evil, a concession to human weakness. The primary norms in medieval religious culture were procreation and chastity, not heterosexuality. This means that while most men and women had opposite sex relationships, this did not necessarily mean they had a heterosexual identity in the modern sense. Understanding these differences helps us appreciate the complexity of medieval views on sex and gender. It also highlights the importance of context in studying historical sexualities. Medieval people's experiences and understandings of sex were deeply rooted in their cultural and social norms, which were very different from our own. When we talk about sexuality in the Middle Ages, we often find ourselves stepping into a world very different from our own. Medieval people had their own ways of thinking about sex and relationships, and these ways often don't match up with our modern categories of heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Instead, medieval society was shaped by different ideas, which we need to explore carefully to understand their perspectives. One of the key thinkers on this topic is the French philosopher Michel Foucault. In his influential work, The History of Sexuality, Foucault argued that the way we think about sexuality today, where our sexual desires are seen as a core part of who we are, didn't exist in the same way in the past. For example, in medieval times, people might have had desires for certain types of partners, but these desires didn't define them as a specific type of person. Instead, acts were what mattered, not identities. A person who engaged in sodomy might be punished for their actions, but they wouldn't be seen as a homosexual in the way we understand it today. This doesn't mean that medieval people didn't have complex ideas about sex. In fact, their society was deeply concerned with sexual behavior, but in different ways. For instance, one of the most significant distinctions in medieval society was between chastity and sexual activity. Being chaste or abstaining from sex was highly valued, especially for religious figures and unmarried women. On the other hand, being sexually active, particularly within marriage, was seen as normal and even expected for others. This divide created two very different social groups, those who were chaste and those who were not. Another important concept that has emerged in recent scholarship is queer theory. Queer theory challenges the idea that sexuality and gender are fixed and unchanging. Instead, it suggests that these categories are constructed by society and can vary widely across different times and places. For medieval studies, this means that we shouldn't assume that medieval people thought about sexuality in the same way we do. For example, a medieval text might describe a relationship that seems same-sex to us, but the medieval audience might not have seen it that way. Queering a text means looking at it with a fresh perspective, one that doesn't assume the categories of homosexual and heterosexual are universal. One example of this is the Old English poem known as The Wife's Lament. For a long time, scholars assumed the speaker was a woman because the poem mourns the absence of a male lover. However, some researchers now suggest that the speaker could be a man. This reevaluation opens up new ways of understanding the poem and the medieval society that produced it. Queer theory isn't just about literature. It also affects how we interpret archaeological evidence. For instance, archaeologists used to assume that graves with weapons belonged to men, and those with weaving tools belonged to women. But this assumption has been challenged, leading to a more nuanced understanding of medieval gender roles. The discovery of warrior graves with female remains, for example, suggests that gender roles were more fluid than previously thought. Gender identity is another area where medieval perspectives differ from modern ones. The concept of genderqueer refers to individuals who don't fit neatly into the binary categories of male or female. Medieval people didn't have the same concepts of gender and sexuality that we do today, but they did recognize that some people's gender identity didn't match their biological sex. This recognition can be seen in various texts and records, even if the terms and categories were different. When we look at the sources from the Middle Ages, It's important to remember that they don't always give us a straightforward picture. Most of the texts we have were written by monks, priests, and other religious figures who had taken vows of chastity. These texts often focus on what was considered sinful or moral, rather than on personal experiences. Additionally, the texts were usually written for specific audiences, such as other religious figures or the literate elite, and not for the general public. Despite these challenges, there is a wealth of material that can help us understand medieval sexuality. Literary texts, such as poetry and romance, can provide insights into how people thought about love and desire. Historical documents, like court records and legal codes, show how society regulated sexual behavior. Religious texts, such as sermons and penitential guides, reveal the moral and theological views on sex. Medical texts, which often included discussions of sexual health and reproduction, also offer valuable information. By carefully examining these sources, we can begin to see how medieval people thought about sexuality and gender. This perspective helps us appreciate the complexity and diversity of medieval society, and it challenges us to rethink our own assumptions about what is natural or normal when it comes to sex and gender. Literary sources can be very helpful in understanding the history of sexuality, but they come with their own set of challenges. Unlike private letters, which are direct and personal, literary works are crafted by authors with specific intentions, often to entertain, educate, or even imagine different worlds. This means that while they can offer vivid and detailed portrayals of medieval life, these portrayals are not always accurate reflections of how people actually lived. For example, medieval literature often uses complex metaphors and allegories. A story about a knight pursuing a gazelle might actually be a metaphor for sexual desire, while a poem about love could be a commentary on the nature of poetry itself. These layers of meaning can make it difficult for modern readers to understand what the author intended, or how medieval audiences would have interpreted the work. Moreover, medieval authors often drew heavily from other texts, both from their own time and from ancient sources. This can make it hard to determine what is original and what is borrowed. For historians, this means that a text might not reflect the specific culture it was written in, but rather the ideals or stories of another time or place. For instance, courtly love motifs found in Hebrew stories don't necessarily tell us about Jewish ideas of love, but rather about the influence of Christian literature. Despite these challenges, literary texts can still provide valuable insights into medieval attitudes and assumptions. Even if a story doesn't depict real events, it can show what the author thought would be plausible or acceptable to their audience. For example, if a medieval author writes about a romance in a matter-of-fact way, it suggests that such relationships were not considered shocking or unusual. Religious texts, including hagiographies, stories of saints, sermons, and legal writings, also offer a wealth of information. These texts often reflect the religious teachings and moral standards of the time. For instance, the frequent condemnation of sexual sins in sermons suggests that such behaviors were common enough to warrant attention. However, the fact that chastity is often celebrated in saints' lives indicates that it was not expected of ordinary people. Legal texts, whether from the church or secular authorities, can be particularly revealing. While they tell us what was prohibited, they don't always tell us what actually happened. For example, the repeated prohibition of fornication and sodomy in church laws suggests that these practices were indeed occurring, but it doesn't tell us how widespread they were or how seriously they were enforced. Court records and Inquisition documents provide a closer look at actual medieval life. These documents can show us the kinds of sexual behaviors that were regulated and punished, but they must be interpreted carefully. For example, church court records are often highly formulaic and may not reflect the true experiences of the people involved. Similarly, Inquisition documents can be biased, as they often rely on confessions obtained under pressure. Medical texts offer another perspective. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors, and many medical writers were also religious figures. These texts can help us understand how medieval people thought about the body and health, and how these beliefs influenced their views on sexuality. For example, the idea that sexual activity was necessary for health and well-being was common, even if the reasons given were different from modern medical understanding. One example of the complexity of interpreting medieval sources is a fabliau, a type of bawdy tale from medieval France. In this story, a fisherman tests his young wife by showing her a severed penis, claiming it is his own. Her initial reaction is one of disgust and a desire to leave, but when he claims a miracle has restored his manhood, she is overjoyed. This story raises many questions. Was it meant to mock the common people for being driven by lust? Did it reflect a belief that women's love was primarily based on sexual satisfaction? Or was it a commentary on the importance of fertility and the desire for children? These questions highlight the challenges of using literary sources to understand medieval sexuality. Each text must be considered in its context, with an awareness of the author's intentions, the audience's expectations, and the cultural norms of the time. While no single text can provide a definitive answer, by piecing together multiple sources, historians can build a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of medieval attitudes towards sexuality. Images, like texts, can be rich sources of information, but they too require careful interpretation. Medieval art often contains symbols and allusions that may have different meanings for modern and medieval viewers. Understanding the context in which an image was created and how it was intended to be understood is crucial for interpreting its meaning accurately. In the end, the history of medieval sexuality is a complex and multifaceted topic. By carefully analyzing literary, religious, legal, and medical texts, as well as visual sources, historians can uncover a rich tapestry of beliefs, practices, and attitudes that shaped medieval life. The Bayeux Tapestry, a famous embroidery from the 11th century, has long been a subject of fascination and debate, particularly the marginal scenes that include naked men and women. These figures, often engaged in provocative poses, have puzzled scholars for decades. What did these images mean to the people who created and viewed them? Were they symbols of fertility, or perhaps a commentary on the moral failings of the English? Or could they simply be playful jabs inserted by the artists? When we consider these images, it's important to remember that the medieval world was not a monolithic entity. Different people such as the Normans, the English, and the monks or nuns who might have embroidered the tapestry would have interpreted these scenes differently. For instance, if the tapestry was indeed made by nuns, as some suggest, they might have seen these images as part of a larger narrative, perhaps as a moral lesson or a humorous aside, rather than as something obscene. The Victorian ladies who recreated the tapestry in the late 19th century edited out the more explicit scenes, reflecting the prudish standards of their time. This contrast with the original suggests that what was considered acceptable in the 11th century might have been quite different from what was acceptable in the Victorian era. This raises the question, was the original tapestry meant to be displayed in a church, or was it intended for a different setting? The lack of a definitive answer underscores the complexity of medieval culture and the challenges of interpreting historical artifacts. Medieval people often did not write openly about sex, and when they did, the context was crucial. For example, the Song of Songs, a biblical text rich with erotic imagery, was interpreted by medieval theologians as an allegory of the soul's love for God. This means that what we might see as erotic, they might have seen as spiritual. Similarly, medieval writers often expressed deep emotions in ways that seem unusual to us today. Aelred of Rivolx, a 12th century abbot, described spiritual friendships with intense, passionate language that might be mistaken for eroticism in modern terms. This highlights the need to understand medieval notions of love and friendship, which were distinct from our own. The concept of nature also varied in the medieval world. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish thinkers all grappled with what was natural and what was not, often using this concept to denounce certain behaviors, such as sodomy. However, the definition of natural was not uniform. For some, it meant sex for procreation. For others, it meant adhering to a divine order. This complexity is reflected in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who saw human nature as inherently rational, and thus any non-procreative sexual act as unnatural. Today, we might use the term natural differently, often to critique behaviors we disapprove of, but the underlying debate about what is natural and what is not has roots in medieval thought. Medieval discussions of sex were not solely the domain of religious or secular authorities. Everyday conversations about sex were likely more open than we might imagine. For example, in the French fabliau, the young woman who couldn't bear to hear about fucking. A farmer's daughter is so sensitive to the word fucking that it makes her ill, yet she is not averse to the act itself. This suggests that while some individuals might have been prudish, the use of explicit language was not uncommon. In medieval Scandinavia, certain insults related to sexual behavior were so serious that they could lead to outlawry, not because of the words themselves, but because of the implications about masculinity and honor. In the end, the medieval world was a tapestry of diverse beliefs and practices, and our understanding of it is limited by the sources that have survived. The Bay, Tapestry, the Song of Songs, and the Fabliaux all offer glimpses into how medieval people thought about sex, but they also remind us of the vast differences between their world and ours. As we interpret these texts and artifacts, we must be cautious about projecting our own modern sensibilities onto the past. The medieval world was complex, and its people's views on sex and nature were far from uniform. By recognizing this, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of their lives and the world they inhabited.